The realization didn't arrive with a bang or a shout. It settled over me like fine dust in a room no one bothers to clean. I was sitting in the corner of the deck at Arthur and Lydia's house, holding a lukewarm seltzer, watching the shadow of the patio umbrella stretch across the manicured lawn. My father-in-law, Arthur, was holding court near the grill, gesturing with a pair of stainless steel tongs. He was talking about the lake house, the one the family had shared for 30 years, and he was talking about it as if I didn't exist, or more accurately, as if I were a piece of the outdoor furniture, sturdy and reliable, but entirely lacking in agency. I am an operations manager for a regional logistics firm. I spend 40 hours a week ensuring that thousands of moving parts, trucks, drivers, pallets, inventory, intersect at the precise microsecond required to keep the gears of commerce turning. I understand systems. I understand how a single delayed signature can stall a multi-million-dollar shipment. People think I'm quiet because I'm shy or because I have nothing to say. The truth is much simpler. I am always calculating the flow of power. "We'll have the surveyors out on Tuesday," Arthur said, his voice carrying that booming, self-assured timbre that had always grated on my nerves. "Marin wants the east wing for her studio, and Lydia thinks we can convert the boathouse into a rental unit. It's the most logical way to liquidate the equity without losing the footprint." Marin, the golden child, nodded vigorously, her wineglass catching the late afternoon sun. My wife, Sloane, sat beside me, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. She was a pediatrician, a woman who spent her days diagnosing ailments and saving lives, yet in this circle she was treated like a temperamental child whose inheritance was a burden to be managed by the adults. I leaned back, feeling the rough grain of the cedar wood against my spine. They were discussing the disposal of property that, by all legal rights, was supposed to be split between the sisters. But I knew the ledger, I had seen the mail, I knew they had been moving accounts for months, siphoning the family legacy into trusts that conveniently bypassed Sloane. They thought I didn't notice because I was the one who fixed their routers, who coordinated their holiday travel, who made sure their cars were serviced. I was the infrastructure, and nobody ever asks the bridge how it feels about the cars driving over it. "Mark can handle the move-out," Lydia said, finally glancing toward me. She didn't look at my eyes. She looked at my hands, as if checking to see if they were ready to lift heavy boxes. "He's so good with the logistics of it all. He can get a crew in there and have the place cleared by the weekend." "I have a name," I said, my voice flat and even. It wasn't a protest. It was a statement of fact. Lydia blinked, a small, tight smile flickering on her face. "Of course you do, dear. We just mean that you're so helpful. We'd be lost without your organizational skills." The condescension was a physical weight. I looked at Sloane. She looked exhausted, her eyes fixed on the grass. She had spent a lifetime being the scapegoat, the one whose achievements were minimized and whose mistakes were magnified. She was the one they blamed for her grandfather's supposed confusion in his final years, simply because she was the only one who actually spent time at his bedside. "Actually," I said, taking a slow sip of my drink, "I'm quite busy on Tuesday. We're rerouting the north-south corridor shipments. I won't be able to oversee any surveyors." The silence that followed was brief but telling. Arthur didn't even stop flipping the stakes. "We'll work around it. Just give us the spare set of keys to the main gate. You still have them in your glove box, right?" He didn't ask if he could have them. He asserted that he would take them. It was a microaggression, one of 1,000 I had endured over the last 7 years. I was the reliable underdog, the man who stayed in the background and kept the lights on while they played their games of status and ego. They saw my silence as consent. They saw my competence as a service they were entitled to. Later that evening, as Sloane and I drove back to our small, impeccably organized home, the air in the car was thick with her unspoken hurt. I watched the streetlights flicker past, my mind already cataloging the inconsistencies in Arthur's story. He was rushing the survey. He was trying to move before the wedding. "They're doing it again," Sloane whispered, her forehead leaning against the cool glass of the passenger window. "They're erasing me. It's like I'm a ghost in my own family." "You're not a ghost," I said, my grip on the steering wheel steady. "Ghosts can't change the locks." "It's just the lake house, Mark. It's just a building." "It's not about the building, Sloane. It's about the fact that they think they can do it without even looking you in the eye. They think I'm a tool they can pick up and put down. They think I'm part of the scenery." I pulled into our driveway, the motion sensor light flooding the gravel with a harsh, clinical white. I didn't turn off the engine immediately. I sat there, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal. I realized then that I had been the one providing the very tools they were using against us. I was the one who had mapped their schedules, who had optimized their finances, who had made their lives so seamless that they had plenty of energy left over for cruelty. "Are you okay?" Sloane asked, sensing the shift in my posture. "I'm fine," I lied. I wasn't fine. I was waking up. "I just realized I left something at the office. I need to go back for an hour." "On a Saturday night?" "Logistics never sleep, Sloane. You know that." I kissed her cheek and watched her go inside. Once the front door clicked shut, I didn't drive to the office. I drove to a 24-hour storage facility on the edge of town where I kept my old records and a few pieces of equipment I'd acquired from various liquidation sales. Inside the cold, corrugated metal unit, I sat at a small folding desk. I pulled up my laptop and accessed the shared family calendar I had set up for them 3 years ago to simplify their lives. I looked at the entries for the upcoming month. The wedding was the centerpiece, the event Sloane had poured her heart into, the one thing she hoped would finally grant her a sense of belonging. I began to look deeper into the metadata of the files Arthur had shared with the estate lawyer, files he had asked me to format and clean up because he couldn't figure out how to convert them to PDF. They thought I was just a clerk. They didn't realize that when you ask an operations manager to handle your data, you are handing him the nervous system of your entire life. I found the email thread. It was buried in a subfolder labeled Miscellaneous Tax Info. It wasn't about taxes. It was a conversation between Arthur, Lydia, and Marin. "She's too fragile for the inheritance," Lydia had written. "If we can just get through the wedding, we can use the mental health clause in the trust. We need to make sure the guests see her for what she is. If she has a breakdown in public, the board won't question the transition of the estate." Marin's reply was even colder. "Mark will be the easy part. He's a follower. He'll do whatever we tell him to do once the checks start bouncing. He doesn't have the spine for a fight." I sat in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. A follower. A man without a spine. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. It wasn't anger, not the hot, impulsive kind that leads to shouting matches. It was the kind of cold, industrial resolve that leads to a total system overhaul. They had spent years relying on my invisibility. They had built their entire plan on the assumption that the quiet man in the corner wasn't listening, wasn't recording, and wasn't capable of striking back. They didn't understand that the person who manages the supplies is the same person who can cut them off. I began to type. I wasn't writing a manifesto or a letter of protest. I was creating a spreadsheet. Column A, the offense. Column B, the vulnerability. Column C, the timeline. I looked at the entry for the wedding. Sloane wanted her grandparents to walk her down the aisle, the only two people in that family who had ever shown her genuine, uncomplicated love. I knew Arthur and Lydia were planning to stop that. They were planning a mass communication strike to ruin her day, to humiliate her so thoroughly that she would retreat into the instability they needed to prove. But they had sent me the guest list. They had given me access to the digital RSVP portal. They had even given me the login for the chapel's audio-visual system so I could make sure the slideshow works. I wasn't the help. I was the architect of their downfall. I just hadn't started building yet. I drove home slowly, my mind humming with the precision of a well-oiled machine. When I walked back into our bedroom, Sloane was already asleep, her face peaceful in the moonlight. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her. She deserved a husband who was a hero. Instead, she was going to get a husband who was a villain to everyone who had ever hurt her. I went to the kitchen and pulled a small black notebook from a junk drawer. I wrote down one name, Arthur, then Lydia, then Marin. Underneath their names, I wrote a single sentence. "The bridge is closed for repairs." The next morning, the phone rang early. It was Arthur. He didn't say hello. "Mark, I've been looking for those keys. I checked the glove box of the SUV while you were asleep. I let myself into the driveway, but they weren't there. Where did you put them?" He had come onto my property, opened my vehicle, and searched it while I was sleeping 10 feet away. The intrusion was so casual, so expected, that he didn't even bother to hide it. "I moved them, Arthur," I said, my voice as calm as a morning pond. "Well, where are they? I need to get the surveyors in." "I realize there's a discrepancy in the property line," I said. "I've initiated a formal review with the county. No one goes onto the land until the audit is complete. It's a logistics thing you wouldn't understand." There was a long pause. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, trying to process a world where I said no. "You did what?" "Mark, don't be difficult. Just give me the keys." "I'm not being difficult, Arthur. I'm being thorough. I'll see you at dinner tonight." I hung up before he could respond. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. For the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly in control. They thought I was the infrastructure. They were right. And I was about to show them what happens when the infrastructure decides to fail. The morning of the wedding was as meticulously organized as a military campaign, at least on the surface. I spent the early hours checking and rechecking the logistics for the reception, the floral arrangements, the catering staff's arrival times, and the placement of the sound system. I moved through the venue like a shadow, a silent ghost in a charcoal suit, ensuring every physical component was in its place. Sloane was in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids who were more interested in their own reflections than in her mounting anxiety. She looked radiant, but it was the radiance of a fuse under high tension. Arthur and Lydia arrived at the chapel 2 hours early, looking like the pillars of the community they believed themselves to be. Arthur's suit was tailored to hide the softness of his middle age, and Lydia wore a hat that spoke of old money and quiet authority. They ignored me as I tested the wireless microphones near the altar. To them, I was merely the technician, a convenient extension of the venue's amenities. They didn't see me watching their thumbs fly across their phone screens. They didn't see me notice the synchronized rhythm of their typing. The first hint of the disruption came 45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I was standing in the vestibule, adjusting the ribbon on the guest book, when I saw the first car pull out of the parking lot instead of into it. Then another. A group of cousins who had traveled from 3 states away suddenly turned their vehicle around and sped toward the exit. I pulled my own phone from my pocket. My screen was silent, but I had cloned the notification feed from the family wedding group chat onto a secondary device. The message had gone out at exactly 1:15 p.m. It was a mass text sent from Arthur's secondary business line to the entire guest list, excluding Sloane and me. With heavy hearts, we must announce that the ceremony is canceled. Sloane is experiencing a sudden and severe health crisis. Out of respect for her privacy and the delicacy of her current state, we ask that you return home and keep her in your thoughts. We will provide updates when she is stable. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. It didn't use harsh language. It used the language of concern to paint her as mentally unfit, a fragile woman whose big day had finally broken her. It was the mental health clause Lydia had mentioned in her emails being activated in real time. By the time the clock struck 2 p.m., the chapel was a cavernous, echoing void. I walked into the bridal suite. The bridesmaids were staring at their phones, whispering. Sloane was standing by the window, her veil trailing on the floor like a discarded shroud. She hadn't seen the text yet, but she could see the empty parking lot. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where is everyone? Why aren't the cars stopping?" I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I simply handed her my secondary phone. She read the message, her eyes scanning the lines once, then twice. The color drained from her face, replaced by a hollow, haunting look of realization. Her own parents had sabotaged her wedding to build a public record of her supposed instability. "They're taking the estate," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're using the grandfather's trust. If they prove I'm not capable, it all reverts to them and Marin." "Stay here," I said. My voice was devoid of heat. It was the voice I used when a warehouse fire threatened a shipment, cold, analytical, and focused on the solution. "Don't take off the dress. Don't cry. Just wait for my signal." I walked back into the main chapel. Arthur and Lydia were sitting in the front row, the only 2 people in the pews. They looked somber, the perfect picture of grieving parents. They hadn't counted on me being the one who controlled the doors. They hadn't counted on me being the one who had invited the extras. I checked my watch. 2:05 p.m. On my signal, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open. But it wasn't the guests who entered. First came Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of the hospital board where Sloane worked as a pediatrician. Behind him were 3 members of the county legal oversight committee, and behind them was a tall, silver-haired man carrying a leather attaché case, Mr. Henderson, the executor of her late grandfather's primary trust. I had spent the last 48 hours doing more than just checking floral arrangements. I had been making phone calls, presenting the evidence of the emails I'd found, and citing the specific clauses of the grandfather's will that Arthur had tried to format out of the digital copies. I had invited these people not as wedding guests, but as witnesses to a legal execution. Arthur stood up, his face reddening. "What is this? This is a private family matter. The wedding is off." "The wedding is very much on, Arthur," I said, walking toward the altar. I didn't look at him. I looked at the legal team. "And since you've been so kind as to inform the public of Sloane's condition, I thought it was only fair that her professional peers and the executors of her grandfather's legacy be here to see her state for themselves." Henderson stepped forward, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Mr. Vance, we received the communication sent from your device 30 minutes ago. Given the gravity of the accusations regarding the beneficiary's mental status, we are required by the Trust's bad faith provision to oversee the proceedings immediately." Lydia's composure shattered. This is absurd. We are her parents. And as her parents, I said, finally looking her in the eye, you have just triggered a very specific clause in the late Mr. Sterling's will, the one that states that any attempt by a secondary beneficiary to interfere with the primary beneficiary's marriage or personal autonomy through deception results in an immediate and irrevocable forfeiture of all residual interests. I signaled to the back. Sloane walked out. She wasn't shaking anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally seen the monster under the bed and realized it was made of cardboard. She walked down that aisle alone, her head held high, passing her stunned parents without a single glance. The grandparents are waiting in the garden, I told her quietly as she reached me. They refused to leave when they got the text. They knew it was a lie. The ceremony was brief. It wasn't a celebration. It was a deposition. We exchanged vows in front of the hospital board and the lawyers. Every word Sloane spoke was a testament to her clarity, her poise, and her absolute fitness. Arthur and Lydia sat trapped in the front row, forced to watch as the very event they tried to destroy became the legal anchor that dragged them into poverty. When the final papers were signed, not just the marriage license, but the transfer of the estate titles that Henderson presented, the air in the room changed. The power had shifted, the infrastructure had rerouted the flow. Arthur tried to approach me as the legal team began to file out. He looked smaller than he had that morning, his suit suddenly appearing too large for his frame. Mark, listen, we can talk about this. We were only doing what we thought was best for the family. I'm not part of your family, Arthur, I said, leaning in so only he could hear. I'm the guy who handles the logistics. And right now, the logistics say that you have 30 days to vacate the lake house before the sheriff arrives to oversee the transition. I've already scheduled the locksmiths for Tuesday. You don't need to give me the keys anymore. I'm changing the cylinders. Lydia was weeping, but there was no sound to it. Just a performative leakage of salt water meant to garner sympathy that wasn't coming. Marin was nowhere to be found. She had likely fled the moment she saw the lawyers. You think you've won? Lydia hissed as I walked past her. You think you can just take everything we've built? I didn't take it, I said, stopping for a brief second. You threw it away. I just made sure it landed in the right hands. You spent years treating me like a floorboard. You forgot that floorboards are what keep you from falling into the basement. As Sloane and I walked out of the chapel, the sunlight was blinding. She took a deep breath, the first real breath I'd seen her take in years. She looked at the empty parking lot and then back at the chapel. It's over, she said. No, I replied, feeling the weight of the black notebook in my pocket. The wedding is over. The rest is just beginning. I watched Arthur and Lydia walk to their car. They looked lost, their movements hesitant and uncoordinated. They were used to being the ones who gave the orders, the ones who shaped reality for everyone else. Now, they were stepping into a world where the rules had changed, and they didn't have the map. I realized then that I wasn't satisfied. The legal victory was clean, procedural, and effective, but it didn't touch the rot beneath. It didn't address the ex-friends who had helped them, the relatives who had smirked at the text messages, or the people who had spent a decade treating me like a piece of equipment. I looked at the logistics of our new life. The estate was ours. The resources were mine to command. I had the keys, the cameras, and the schedules. I had spent years being underestimated, and I had used that time to learn every weakness, every vanity, and every secret they possessed. As we drove away from the empty chapel, I didn't feel like a groom. I felt like a technician who had just finished the diagnostic phase. The system was broken, and it was my job to ensure that the parts that couldn't be fixed were removed entirely. The silence in the car was no longer heavy. It was the silence of a well-calibrated engine, humming at a frequency only I could hear. I glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the chapel disappear behind us. I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for the next target on the list. Arthur had been the first, but he wouldn't be the last. I had discovered that someone else had been playing a similar game, someone who had been feeding the parents information about my own bank accounts and my professional standing, someone who believed they were still in my inner circle. I felt a dark, cold humor bubble up in my chest. They thought I was the stable one. They were right. I was as stable as a mountain, and they were about to find out how much damage a mountain can do when it decides to move. The immediate aftermath of the wedding was a study in artificial silence. While Sloane focused on the legal transition of the estate, a process that required her to be the face of grace and professional composure, I returned to my role as the invisible coordinator. To the outside world, I was the supportive husband, the man who had stood by his wife during a family crisis. But inside the quiet of my home office, I was looking at a map. Not a map of geography, but a map of dependencies. Every person who had contributed to that mass text, every person who had whispered behind Sloane's back, was connected to a network of physical and digital needs that I managed. I spent the first few days of our marriage not on a honeymoon, but in a state of high-precision observation. I needed to know exactly who had known about the plan to humiliate Sloane. It wasn't just Arthur and Lydia. They were too technologically inept to have coordinated the timing so perfectly. There was a second architect, someone who understood how to manipulate the group dynamic from the inside. I found the first thread while I was cleaning up the wedding gift registry and the guest data for the thank you notes. I noticed a series of IP addresses that had accessed the private wedding portal in the weeks leading up to the event. One address appeared dozens of times, far more than necessary for a guest checking the venue address. I traced it to a residential router in the suburbs. It belonged to Greg, my supposed best friend since university, a man who had stood in my wedding party while holding the very knife the parents had used to cut Sloane down. Greg was a contractor, a man whose business relied entirely on the reputation I helped him maintain. I had spent years throwing him subcontracts for our logistics warehouses, ensuring he was the first name called when a facility needed a retrofit. He was reliable because I made him reliable. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was logistical. I found a series of encrypted messages on a shared cloud drive we used for project management. Greg hadn't just known about the parents' plan. He had helped them draft the text message to ensure it reached the highest number of guests without being flagged as spam. He had also provided Arthur with a list of my private financial accounts, suggesting that my quiet nature was actually a sign of hidden debt or instability. He was trying to clear the board of both of us so he could position himself as the loyal son figure to Arthur and Lydia's newly consolidated wealth. I sat in my office, the only light coming from the 3 monitors that displayed the various layers of Greg's life. I could see his project schedules, his fleet of work trucks, all of which were outfitted with GPS trackers I had recommended for his insurance, and his upcoming site inspections. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of social climbing. He didn't realize he was a node on a circuit, and I was the one at the breaker box. My first move was not a confrontation, it was a pressure test. I waited until Tuesday morning, the day Greg was scheduled to begin a high-profile renovation for a local city official, a job I had personally secured for him. At 6 a.m., I initiated a series of automated maintenance requests for his fleet. Through the fleet management software I had set up for him as a favor, I remotely triggered a software update on his 3 primary work vans. The update was designed to hang at 99%, rendering the vehicles immobilized for the duration of the morning. Next, I turned my attention to his physical workspace. Greg kept his primary inventory in a warehouse that utilized a smart lock system I had installed during a weekend work party the previous summer. With a few keystrokes, I reconfigured the access codes, setting a delay that would only allow the doors to open for 5 minutes every 3 hours. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to frustrate the machinery of his life until he began to crack. By 9 a.m., my phone began to buzz. It was Greg. I let it ring. I watched his GPS icon on my screen as he paced around his driveway, likely staring at a van that refused to start. I could imagine his heart rate climbing, the frantic calls to the city official, the excuses piling up like discarded lumber. I spent the afternoon at a local hardware store, but not for anything related to the wedding. I was buying materials for a more personal project. As I pushed my cart through the aisles, I ran into a relative named Marcus. Marcus was Marin's husband, a man who had made a habit of making jokes about my job, calling me a glorified delivery boy at family dinners. "Hey, Mark," Marcus said, his tone dripping with that familiar, unearned superiority. "Tough break about the wedding. Shame about Sloane's, how's she holding up? Still seeing the doctors?" He was fishing. He wanted to see if the plan had worked, if the seeds of doubt they'd planted were growing. I looked at him, noting the way he held himself, the expensive watch, the polished shoes, the posture of a man who thought he was untouchable. "She's fine, Marcus," I said, my voice empty of emotion. "We're actually very busy. The estate transfer is taking up a lot of time, lots of locks to change, lots of inventory to count." Marcus's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Right, the estate. Well, if you need a hand with the heavy lifting, let me know. I know you're used to the smaller tasks." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. "By the way, I saw your car in the lot. Nice Mercedes. The E-Class, right? I heard they have some issues with the remote start systems in this humidity. You should keep an eye on that." I walked away before he could ask what I meant. I didn't need to explain. I had already accessed the manufacturer's service portal for his specific VIN earlier that morning. It wasn't a hack. It was a simple matter of using the Find My Car permissions he had accidentally left active on a shared tablet during the last family holiday. The first action sequence happened that evening. I knew Greg would be at his favorite bar, trying to drink away the stress of a lost contract and a broken fleet. I waited for him in the parking lot, sitting in the shadows of my dark SUV. When he emerged, stumbling slightly from the frustration of the day, he found me leaning against his immobilized van. He stopped, his eyes widening. "Mark? Man, I've been trying to call you all day. My trucks are toasted. The city job is a mess." "I know," I said. I stood up, closing the distance between us. I am not a large man, but I am a man who knows exactly how to occupy space. I stepped into his personal bubble, forcing him to take a step back until he was pressed against the cold metal of his own vehicle. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice shaking. I didn't touch him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached out and tapped the glass of the driver's side window. "I was just thinking about that text message, Greg. The one you helped Arthur write, the one where you called my wife unstable." Greg's face went a sickly shade of gray in the amber glow of the parking lot lights. "Mark, look, I can explain. Arthur. He's a powerful guy. He pressured me. He said it was for her own good." "You don't understand how things work, do you?" I asked. I leaned in closer, my face inches from his. I could smell the stale hops on his breath. "You think the people at the top make the decisions? But it's the people who manage the routes, the people who hold the keys, and the people who know where the bodies of the contracts are buried who actually run the world. You're a contractor, Greg. You build things. But I'm the one who decides if the ground underneath you stays solid." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small plastic key fob. I pressed a button, and the van's lights flashed. The central locking system cycled with a series of sharp, mechanical clicks. "I'm going to give you a choice," I said. "You can call Arthur right now and tell him that you're going to testify about the trust interference. Or you can watch as every single client you have receives a detailed report of the materials substitutions you've been making on your jobs for the last 3 years. I have the invoices, Greg. I have the photos of the substandard wiring you hid behind the drywall in the Benson project." "You wouldn't," he gasped. "I already have the emails drafted. They're on a timer, just like your trucks, just like your access to my warehouses." I stepped back, giving him air. He looked like he was going to collapse. I didn't feel pity. I felt the same cold satisfaction I felt when a complex shipping manifest finally balanced out to zero. "You're a villain," he whispered. "No," I said, turning to walk away. "I'm the guy you ignored, and ignoring the man who holds the map is the biggest logistical error you'll ever make." As I drove home, I checked the status of the Mercedes. I remotely activated the panic alarm on Marcus's car while he was likely at a quiet dinner with Marin and her parents. I did it 3 times at 10-minute intervals until he was forced to go out into the rain to manually reset it. It was a small, petty humiliation, but it was just the beginning. The twist came when I arrived home. I found a manila envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside were photos of me at the storage unit, photos of me at my desk, and a printed copy of my spreadsheet. Someone had been watching me. Someone knew exactly what I was doing, and that person hadn't stopped me. I looked up at my house. The lights were on in the living room. Sloane was sitting on the sofa, reading a medical journal. She looked up and waved through the window, a small, knowing smile on her face. I realized then that the betrayal went deeper than I had imagined. The mental health angle wasn't just Arthur's idea. It was a trap that had been set long before the wedding, and I had been the intended trigger. They wanted me to react. They wanted me to become the aggressor so they could use my volatility to justify stripping Sloane of everything. But they had made one fatal mistake. They thought I would react with emotion. They didn't realize that for a man like me, revenge isn't a feeling. It's an operational procedure. I walked into the house, the envelope tucked under my arm. I didn't say a word to Sloane about it. I just sat down next to her and asked how her day was. "Quiet," she said, her eyes never leaving the page. "But I think the weather is about to change. Don't you?" "I've checked the forecast," I said. "It's going to be a very long season." The cliffhanger wasn't the envelope. It was the realization that I had access to everything they relied on, including their own sense of safety. And I was about to turn their entire world into a series of delayed shipments and closed doors. The pressure test began on a Thursday. In the world of logistics, Thursdays are the pivot point of the week. If the momentum isn't right by midday, the entire weekend schedule collapses. I spent the morning in my home office, my fingers moving across the keyboard with the rhythmic precision of a typist who no longer needs to look at the keys. I wasn't just managing the flow of goods for my company anymore. I was managing the friction in the lives of the 3 people who had decided that my silence was a sign of weakness. I started with relative number 3, a cousin of Sloane's named Julian. Julian was a mid-level executive at a regional bank who took immense pride in his image of corporate efficiency. He was the kind of man who posted photos of his morning power breakfast and mocked anyone who worked with their hands. He had been the primary distributor of the wedding text, adding his own commentary about how unfortunate it was for the family reputation. Julian's weakness was his reliance on a hyper-optimized schedule. I had access to his calendar through a shared family permissions group he had forgotten to scrub after the last holiday planning session. I began to introduce noise into his system. I didn't delete his appointments, I shifted them. A client lunch at 12 p.m. was moved to 1:30 p.m. A board briefing at 9 a.m. was pushed to 8:45 a.m. I did this across 3 different platforms, ensuring the sync errors created a cascading failure of his punctuality. By 10 a.m., I was watching the fallout through a remote desktop connection to the bank's public terminal. Julian arrived late to his own presentation, breathless and disheveled. The digital display in the lobby showed his name flashing in red for a missed check-in. It was a minor, public humiliation, the kind of professional stain that someone like Julian would feel like a physical blow, but the real work was with ex-friend number 2, a man named Trevor who worked as a luxury car broker. Trevor had been the one to provide Arthur with the proof that I was financially overextended, a lie he had crafted by spoofing my signature on a series of predatory loan inquiries. Trevor's entire life was built on the perception of high-end access. He moved vehicles for the wealthy, and his reputation was his only currency. I visited the showroom where Trevor worked, not as a customer, but as a compliance inspector. My company handled the logistics for the transport firm that moved his inventory. I wore my high-visibility vest and carried a ruggedized tablet, looking every bit the faceless bureaucrat. Trevor didn't even look up as I walked through the showroom floor. He was too busy arguing with someone on his headset about a missing shipment of Italian leather interiors. "The manifest is clear, Trevor," I said, leaning against the polished hood of a silver convertible. He jumped, his phone nearly slipping from his hand. "Mark, what are you doing here? This is a restricted area." "I'm just doing a spot check on the transport logs," I said, tapping my tablet. "It seems there's a discrepancy in the vehicle identification numbers for the last 3 deliveries. We've had to flag the entire fleet for a secondary audit." Trevor's face tightened. "An audit? Now? I have a client coming in 2 hours for that vehicle. It's a custom order." "The system is the system, Trevor. If the numbers don't match, the vehicles don't move. I'm sure you understand the importance of accuracy. After all, you're the one who told Arthur how important it is to keep a clean ledger." I looked him in the eye, and for the first time, he saw me. Not the quiet Mark who brought the beer to the barbecue, but the man who held the digital leash to his livelihood. "You're doing this because of the wedding," he hissed, glancing around to make sure no one could hear. "It was just business, Mark. Arthur promised me a seat on the board of his new holding company. I couldn't say no." "It's always just business until the logistics fail, Trevor. Right now, your business is a series of red flags on a screen. I've already alerted the transport drivers. They won't be picking up any of your units until the audit is cleared, and given the backlog at the county level, that could take weeks. You can't do that. I'll call your supervisor." "Go ahead," I said, stepping closer. "My supervisor is currently reviewing the report I submitted regarding the irregularities in your transport billing. It seems you've been overcharging the firm for insurance premiums that don't exist. I found the documents in the shared drive, the same one you used to send those fake loan inquiries about me." The color left Trevor's face so quickly he had to steady himself against a nearby desk. He wasn't just looking at a professional delay, he was looking at a total exposure of his fraudulent practices. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I don't want anything from you, Trevor. I just want you to experience what it's like when the world stops working for you. I want you to feel the weight of every door that closes in your face." I walked out of the showroom, the glass doors clicking shut with a finality that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. As I reached my car, I checked the GPS for Arthur's SUV. He was at the lake house, likely trying to coordinate the move-out I had blocked with the property audit. The action intensified that afternoon. I drove to the lake house, but I didn't pull into the driveway. I parked on the shoulder of the road, half a mile away, and pulled out my laptop. The house was equipped with a smart home system I had installed for Arthur 3 years ago. It controlled the lights, the climate, the security cameras, and the automated gate. I began the execution phase. First, I activated the irrigation system. It was a high-pressure setup designed to keep the lawn green during the summer, but I had reconfigured the nozzles to spray inward toward the house's large, expensive cedar deck where Arthur was currently sitting. I watched through the security camera feed as the water hammered the deck, soaking his paperwork and his laptop within seconds. Arthur scrambled to get inside, but I had already triggered the lockdown mode. The smart locks engaged on all exterior doors. He was trapped on the deck, surrounded by a wall of high-pressure water. It was a humiliating spectacle. A grown man, a pillar of the community, being pelted by his own sprinkler system, unable to enter his own home because he couldn't remember the manual override code I had given him, and he had promptly ignored. I let it continue for exactly 10 minutes, long enough to ruin his electronics and his dignity, but not long enough to cause any lasting damage to the property. When I finally released the locks and turned off the water, I saw him stumble into the house, dripping wet and shaking with rage. My phone rang. It was Arthur. "Mark, the house is possessed." The sprinklers went off and the doors locked. "I'm soaked. Where are you?" "I'm at the office, Arthur," I said, my voice a calm, steady drone. "It sounds like a system failure. I told you that the software was outdated. You really should have let me perform that update last month. I'll see if I can look at it remotely, but the network seems unstable." "Unstable? I'm the one who's unstable. My laptop is ruined. All the estate documents were on there." "That is unfortunate. I hope you had a backup, though as I recall, you didn't think the logistics of data management were a priority." I hung up and turned my attention back to the screen. I had one more task for the day, and I accessed the public records portal for the local country club, the place where Lydia spent her afternoons maintaining the social standing she valued above all else. I didn't do anything illegal. I simply filed a formal inquiry regarding the club's guest policy and membership requirements, attaching a series of public social media posts from the wedding weekend that depicted Arthur and Lydia in a less than favorable light. I labeled it as an ethics review request from a concerned member of the professional community. The blow would be subtle at first, but in the small, gossipy world Lydia inhabited, it would be devastating. By the time the sun began to set, the people who had tried to erase my wife were all dealing with their own logistical failures. I drove home, the dark humor of the situation finally beginning to settle in my chest. They still thought I was the harmless one. They thought these were all coincidences, a series of unfortunate events triggered by a world that was simply becoming more complex. They didn't realize that the complexity was me. When I entered the house, I found an innocent bystander in the kitchen, our neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She was a kind, elderly woman who often brought over baked goods. She was talking to Sloane about the strange luck everyone in the family seemed to be having. "I heard about poor Arthur," Mrs. Gable said, shaking her head. "And that young man Trevor at the car place. It's like a plague of bad luck is following the family. I hope you two are staying safe." "We're doing just fine, Mrs. Gable," I said, taking a piece of her lemon cake. "We keep our systems updated. It makes all the difference." Sloane caught my eye. There was a flicker of something there. Not fear, but a deep, resonant recognition. She knew. She had seen the way I looked at my monitors. She had seen the black notebook, and yet she didn't say a word to stop me. The rehook happened just before I went to bed. I was doing a final sweep of the security feeds when I noticed a log entry I hadn't seen before. Someone had accessed the smart home system at the lake house an hour before I did. They hadn't changed anything. They had simply watched. I traced the login. It wasn't Greg. It wasn't Trevor. It was an encrypted signal originating from a professional-grade VPN. I looked at the access history for the last 6 months. This person had been silent, observing every move I made, every plan I drafted, and every betrayal I discovered. They had been the one who sent me the envelope. I sat back in my chair, the realization hitting me like a physical weight. I wasn't the only one who had been using the infrastructure to watch the family. Someone else had been orchestrating the chaos, and they had been using me as the primary instrument of their revenge. The betrayal I had felt at the wedding was only the first layer. The person who had really orchestrated everything, the text, the trust interference, the mental health narrative, wanted me to become the villain. They wanted me to dismantle the family so they could step in and claim the wreckage. And the most terrifying part was that I knew exactly who it was. The person who believed I was harmless wasn't Arthur or Lydia. It was the person who was currently sleeping in the other room, waiting for me to finish the work they had started years ago. The realization didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to move faster. I realized that I was never ignored. I was being used as the very infrastructure of someone else's vengeance. And if I was the infrastructure, then I was the only one who could decide to tear the whole system down, including the person who thought they were holding the remote. The morning air was crisp, the kind of clear, biting cold that makes every movement feel sharper, more intentional. I didn't look at Sloane as she drank her coffee. I watched her reflection in the darkened screen of my tablet. She was composed, her pediatric journals spread out before her, the picture of a woman reclaiming her life from the wreckage of her parents' greed. But I now knew that the wreckage had been carefully steered toward the rocks. I wasn't just a husband protecting his wife. I had been the specialized tool she used to dismantle her enemies without getting her own hands dirty. I left the house without a word, my mind focused on the master traitor. I had spent the night tracing the encrypted VPN signal that had been shadowing my every digital move. It hadn't led back to Arthur or Greg. It had led to a high-end co-working space downtown, a place where Marin, the golden child, kept a creative studio. Marin had always played the part of the flighty artist, the one too elevated by her own aesthetic vision to be bothered with the grubby details of family finances or logistics. But the logs told a different story. She was the one who had filtered the information to Arthur and Lydia. She had played them like instruments, convincing them that Sloane was a liability so that they would act, knowing full well that their clumsy attempts at sabotage would trigger the trust's bad faith clauses. She didn't just want a share of the inheritance. She wanted the whole thing, and she had used me to ensure our parents were legally disqualified. I drove toward the studio, my movements calculated and calm. I wasn't going there for a confrontation, I was going for a pursuit. I knew Marin's schedule better than she did. I knew that at 10 a.m., she met with her gallery representative to discuss the new direction of her work that was currently being funded by the very estate funds she had manipulated into Sloane's name, knowing Sloane would always share with her struggling sister. I spotted her car, a cream-colored vintage convertible, pulling out of the studio parking lot. I didn't follow closely. I didn't need to. I had placed a localized signal jammer in the wheel well of her car the night before. It wouldn't stop the vehicle, but it would intermittently disrupt her GPS and her phone's cellular connection. I wanted her isolated. I wanted her to feel the environment itself becoming hostile. The pursuit was a slow-motion tightening of the noose. As she reached the industrial district, the jammer kicked in. I watched from 2 blocks back as her car slowed, her head ducking down as she likely checked her phone for a signal that wasn't there. She took a wrong turn, then another. I used my tablet to override the municipal traffic light synchronization on her route. Every light she approached turned red. Every intersection became a bottleneck. I was controlling the flow of the city around her, turning the urban landscape into a labyrinth. I saw her posture change through my binoculars, the casual lean replaced by a rigid, frantic checking of her mirrors. She knew someone was there, but in the midday glare of the city, I was just another anonymous SUV in a sea of logistics. She finally pulled into an alleyway behind an old textile mill, likely trying to reboot her navigation system. I pulled in behind her, blocking the exit. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum. Marin stepped out of her car, her expensive silk scarf fluttering in the wind. She looked around, her eyes wide. When she saw my car, she didn't look relieved. She looked terrified. She knew that the quiet husband she had mocked for years was the only person with the capability to orchestrate this level of environmental control. I rolled down the window. "You missed your meeting, Marin." "Mark, what are you doing?" "My phone is out. My GPS is looping. I'm lost." "You aren't lost, Marin. You're exactly where your choices have led you. I saw the logs. I saw the VPN. I saw the drafts of the messages you sent to Greg to make sure he accidentally leaked the trust details to me." Her face went pale, the artistic mask slipping to reveal a sharp, desperate hunger. "I did it for us, Mark. Sloane is too soft. She would have let Arthur and Lydia bleed that estate dry for years. I just accelerated the process. I made sure you had the ammunition to protect her." "You didn't do it for Sloane," I said, my voice as cold as the shadow of the mill. "You did it because you knew I was the only one who could actually execute the plan. You used me as your infrastructure. You thought you could sit in your studio and watch the fallout, then step in as the comforting sister while I did the dirty work of destroying your parents. And it worked, didn't it?" she snapped, her voice rising in a shrill, defensive peak. "We have the money. Sloane is safe. You should be thanking me for giving you the chance to be the hero." I stepped out of the car. I didn't move fast. I moved with the heavy, inevitable weight of a machine that had been set in motion. I walked toward her, and she backed away until she hit the brick wall of the mill. "I'm not a hero, Marin," I said, "and I'm not your tool. You think because you understand the psychology of the family, you're the one in charge. But you forgot that the psychology doesn't matter if the lights don't turn on, if the accounts don't sync, if the car won't find the way home." I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. It was a mirror of her own private cloud storage, the one where she kept the digital evidence of her manipulations, her secret bank accounts, and the recordings she'd made of Arthur and Lydia discussing their plans. The betrayal was partially justified, I said, a realization that had been gnawing at me since I found the envelope. They were going to hurt Sloane. They were going to ruin her. And you stopped them, but you did it by becoming the very thing they are. You're just a more efficient version of Arthur. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I'm going to do what I do best," I said. "I'm going to reroute the shipment. I've already transferred your digital archive to the estate lawyers, not as a gift, but as evidence of conspiracy. And as for your creative funding, the accounts you've been skimming from are being frozen for a forensic audit. "You're not going to the gallery, Marin. You're going to a deposition." I turned back to my car, the pursuit over. But as I reached the door, she shouted after me, "You think you're so smart, Mark. You think you're the one holding the strings. Ask your wife about the envelope. Ask her who actually gave you the password to my cloud drive." I froze. The car door was halfway open. I looked back at Marin, who was laughing now, a jagged, hysterical sound. "Sloane knew everything," she cried. "She's been the one pointing you at us since the beginning. She knew you'd react this way. She knew that if she played the victim, you'd become the monster she needed to wipe the slate clean. You're not the architect, Mark. You're just the heavy machinery." I drove away. The city lights blurred into long white streaks. The tension in my chest wasn't from the chase. It was from the sudden, jarring shift in the landscape. I had spent weeks believing I was the one protecting a fragile woman from a predatory family. I had leaned into the role of the calculating villain to save her. But if Marin was right, the person I was protecting didn't exist. The scapegoat had been the one holding the map all along. She had known about the wedding text. She had known about the trust. She had even known that I would find the misplaced files in the tax folder because she was the one who put them there. The pursuit wasn't over. It had just changed direction. I wasn't heading home to a wife who needed my comfort. I was heading toward a final confrontation with the person who had truly mastered the logistics of my life. The realization reframed every scene I had lived through over the last 7 years. Every time I thought I was being ignored, I was actually being positioned. Every time I thought I was invisible, I was actually being shielded so I could work without interference. They hadn't underestimated me. They had weaponized me. I pulled into our driveway. The house was dark, except for a single light in the kitchen. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. I looked at the black notebook in the passenger seat. There was one name left. I felt a strange, hollow sense of respect. If she had done this, if she had orchestrated her own parents' downfall and her sister's professional destruction using nothing but my own protective instincts, then she was the most formidable person I had ever met. I walked toward the front door, my footsteps heavy on the gravel. I wasn't angry, I was impressed. But in the world of logistics, a system that works too perfectly is often the most dangerous one of all. I pushed the door open. Sloane was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of water in front of her. She didn't look up as I entered. "Marin missed her meeting," I said. "I know," Sloane replied, her voice calm and melodic. "I got a call from the gallery. They were very concerned." "How did you get the password to her cloud drive, Sloane?" She finally looked up. Her eyes were bright, clear, and entirely devoid of the exhaustion she had worn like a cloak for years. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She just tilted her head slightly, studying me as if I were a complex problem she had finally solved. "I didn't need the password, Mark. I'm the one who set up her backup system 3 years ago. I just waited for you to be ready to look for it." The final confrontation was inevitable. I had spent the day hunting a traitor, only to find that I had been sharing a bed with the master of the game. And as I looked at her, I realized that the story wouldn't end with an apology or a reconciliation. It would end with the final action. The bridge was closed, but the road was still there, and we were both standing on the edge of the collapse. The kitchen light hummed, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to sync with the steady pulse in my temples. Sloane sat perfectly still, her hands wrapped around the glass of water. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She didn't look like the pediatrician who spent her days worrying about growth charts and vaccinations. She looked like a general who had just watched her final flank maneuver succeed. I stood by the door, the weight of the day's revelation settling into my bones like lead. I had spent years thinking I was the guardian of a fragile heart, but I was just the kinetic energy behind her intent. "You didn't just want the estate," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You wanted them erased. You wanted the entire family structure dismantled so there was nothing left for them to stand on." Sloane took a slow sip of water. "They spent 27 years treating me like a resource to be managed, Mark. They were never going to stop. Even if we had a perfect wedding, they would have spent the rest of our lives trying to find a way to take what they felt was theirs. I didn't create the rot. I just provided the ventilation so it would finish what it started." "And me?" I asked. "What was I? The logistics coordinator? The hired muscle?" She stood up then, walking toward me. Her movements were fluid, devoid of the hesitation she usually displayed in the presence of her parents. She stopped just a few inches away, looking up at me with an expression that was terrifyingly appreciative. "You were the only person capable of seeing the world the way it actually is. I knew that if I showed you the truth, you wouldn't just be angry, you would be precise. I needed precision, Mark. I needed someone who could change the world without breaking a single law." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She hadn't just used me, she had validated me. She had recognized the potential for the villainous, calculating efficiency that everyone else had dismissed as mere social awkwardness. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever done to me, and it was also the most devastating. But there was one final task on my list. The master traitor wasn't just the person who started the fire. It was the person who ensured the exits were blocked. I realized that my revenge couldn't stop at the parents or the sister. It had to conclude with a demonstration of my own autonomy. If I were truly the infrastructure, I had to prove that I could choose to shut down for everyone, including her. "The board meeting is in an hour," I said, checking my watch. "The board meeting?" Sloane asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "For the hospital foundation, the one where you're supposed to be inducted as the new chairwoman of the pediatric wing, the one funded by the Sterling estate." She smiled, a small triumphant curve of her lips. "Yes, the final step. Once I'm confirmed, the transition is complete. My parents will have no path back, and Marin will be a footnote." "I've already sent the digital presentation to the board secretary," I said. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my laptop. I told them I was finalizing the visuals for your acceptance speech. "Thank you, Mark. I knew I could count on you for the details." We drove to the hospital foundation building in silence. The city was glowing with the artificial light of commerce and progress. I watched the navigation screen, but I wasn't looking for traffic. I was watching the synchronized release of the final documents I had prepared. When we arrived, the lobby was filled with the local elite, authority figures, donors, and the hospital board members who had witnessed our marriage. They greeted Sloane with warmth and deference. She was the hero of the story now, the woman who had survived her parents' cruelty to claim her rightful place as a benefactor. We were ushered into the boardroom. Arthur and Lydia were there too, standing in the back corner like ghosts. They had been invited as a gesture of reconciliation, a move I now realized was Sloane's way of forcing them to watch her final coronation. They looked broken, their eyes downcast, their social standing evaporated. The chairman of the board, a man named Dr. Halloway, stepped to the podium. "Before we begin the formal induction of Dr. Sloane Sterling Vance, we have a short presentation prepared by her husband, Mark, detailing the future logistics of the new pediatric wing." The lights dimmed. Sloane stood at the front of the room, her back to the screen, facing the audience with a look of serene accomplishment. She expected a slideshow of architectural renders and budget spreadsheets. The first slide appeared. It wasn't a building, it was a screenshot of the encrypted VPN logs. The room went silent. I stood at the back, my finger on the remote. The next slide was a recording of the conversation between Marin and Sloane from 3 months ago, the one I had recovered from the cloud drive. In it, Sloane's voice was clear, discussing the trigger events needed to ensure the trust's bad faith clause was activated. She wasn't the victim, she was the architect. She was heard explaining exactly how she would use my protective nature to force her parents into a legal corner. The murmur in the room began as a low hum and rose into a sharp, jagged edge of collective shock. Sloane didn't move. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the board members, but the serenity was gone. It was replaced by a cold, frozen mask of realization. "This is a mistake," Dr. Halloway stammered, looking at me. "Mark, what is this?" I didn't answer him. I hit the button for the final slide. It was a document I had drafted that morning. It was a full, voluntary disclosure of the irregularities in the Sterling estate transfer. I had flagged the entire process for a state audit, citing the very evidence Sloane had provided me. Because the evidence had been obtained through my unauthorized access to the cloud drives, it wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a legal quagmire that would tie up the estate in litigation for a decade. Sloane hadn't won, neither had her parents. By exposing the machinery of the betrayal, I had neutralized the prize. The estate would be consumed by legal fees and oversight committees. The reputation she had carefully rebuilt was now permanently linked to a conspiracy she had authored. I walked toward her, the sound of my shoes on the hardwood floor the only noise in the room. The authority figures, the lawyers, the board members, stood powerless. They were people who relied on rules, and I had just rewritten the manual. I stopped in front of her. Her eyes were dark, filled with a fury that was almost beautiful in its purity. "You destroyed it," she whispered. "You destroyed everything I worked for." "I didn't destroy it, Sloane," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I just handled the logistics. You wanted a villain to clear the board. You just didn't realize that a real villain doesn't take orders." I looked over at Arthur and Lydia. They weren't celebrating. They were staring at their daughter with a new kind of fear. They realized that she was more dangerous than they ever were, and that I was the only thing that had been standing between them and her total victory. "The bridge is gone," I said to her, "for everyone." I turned and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't look back at the cameras, the shocked donors, or the woman I had once believed I would give everything for. I walked through the lobby and out into the cool night air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from the fleet management software at my office. A shipment had been delayed. A driver was asking for instructions. I looked at the message for a long second. Then I hit the delete button. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my feet. The story was over. There was no aftermath to manage, no reflection to offer, and no redemption to seek. I had been the infrastructure of their lives, the quiet man who made everything work. And in the end, I had simply decided to stop. I started the engine. The dashboard lit up with a cool, blue light, showing me the map of the city. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't have a destination. I didn't have a schedule. I was just a man in a vehicle, moving through a world that no longer had a plan for me. I put the car in gear and drove toward the edge of the city, leaving the wreckage of the Sterling family behind. The silence in the car was absolute, the kind of